My fellow Singaporeans, I wanted to speak to you today to give you my thoughts on Budget 2021. Firstly, the Finance Minister has claimed that he provided an unprecedented level of stimulus to help the Singapore economy through the pandemic. Figures of $100 billion have been touted around. This is simply not true. The budget deficit, according to his figures in 2020, was about $64 billion. However, this is inaccurate. Firstly, we should take off the net investment returns contribution. Most of this was put into endowments and trust funds, except for less than $1 billion. If we take that off, we are left with a figure of about $44 billion. Spending from the endowments and trust funds was $5 billion, according to the budget statement. But when I looked at the budget closely, I found that Heng had already charged this in other transfers, so he was in effect charging Singaporeans twice for spending the same amount of money. Once by putting it into the endowments and trust funds, and second time when it came out of the endowment and trust funds and was used for actual spending. Then the job support scheme was $26 billion, which Heng said went to keep Singaporeans in jobs. A large part of this would merely have been transfers from one pocket to another, from the budget to the government-linked companies like Singapore Airlines, DBS, CapitaLand, etc. So we can't say what the real deficit was. And of course, there is the revenue from land sales. This was much reduced in 2020, but it amounted to $7.5 billion. It's usually between $11 and $15 billion a year. When we add all this in, the government's deficit was much less, and may even have been a small surplus. The economy, as a result, suffered. We ended up 2020 with an economy about 5% smaller than it was in 2019. By contrast, the US, which was much more affected by the pandemic, ended up the year only 3.5% smaller than at the start of the year, and this was largely due to the much higher levels of stimulus given to the US economy. In the US, support was about 18% of GDP, whereas in Singapore it might have been only about 5 to 6%. 2021, the budget 2021, continues this inadequate stimulus. The Prime Minister has projected that our economy will not even fully recover by the end of 2021, whereas the US is expected to recover by mid-2021. The Finance Minister has said that he expects to run an $11 billion deficit in 2021, but again, this is grossly misleading. Firstly, it doesn't include the revenue from land sales. It only includes up to half of the net investment returns contributions, which are forecast at about $20 billion next year. And the net investment returns contribution is also an extremely bogus figure. Please read my blog at Jeyretnam.com to find out why this is so. The net investment returns contribution is the expected real return on the reserves, but only up to 50% of the expected real returns. As I said there's no real reason why we shouldn't include the full return on the reserves. So it is likely very low as a percentage of the reserves. ARB's forecast suggested that it may be only about 1%. If we take a 1% figure as the net investment returns contribution as a percentage of the reserves, that means, and remember that the reserves don't include anything shown in the government statement as assets and liabilities, because the statement as assets and liabilities are deliberately excluded from the calculation of the NIRC. So it's purely on the reserves that GIC, Temasek and MAS manage. So I've calculated that if they're only taking 1% of the reserves and their reserves do not include any of those shown in the statement as assets and liabilities, then the government presumably is sitting on at least $2 trillion as hidden reserves, and plus the $600 billion or so that is shown in the statement as asset and liabilities over and above the amount that this represents government securities or government debt. So theoretically, the government is sitting on huge reserves, an abundance of riches, and yet it says it has no money to help Singaporeans, and taxes should go up. But on my calculations, this is completely bogus. In fact, we could be spending, if we took a figure like 4% of the total reserves, we could be spending over $100 billion a year on helping Singaporeans. Imagine that what that would pay for. Maybe certainly universal health care, free university education for everyone, and perhaps a universal basic income of $1,000 per Singaporean adult, and extra payment for children. If you would like to learn more about this and ask me some questions, then we will be having a Zoom meeting in the near future to discuss this. So please stay tuned and for further announcements. The government's argument is that the size of the reserves needs to stay secret. But this is a bogus argument. The real reason they want to keep the reserves secret is because they don't want you, the citizens, to know how much money there is, so that they do not have to fund social spending that you deserve, that you are entitled to. And secondly, because they want to keep the Singapore dollar undervalued. And if other countries realize how much has been accumulated through this undervaluation of the Singapore dollar would be pushed up. And the government wants to continue accumulating reserves and running surpluses to your detriment, because that means that you cannot enjoy a better lifestyle that you would be entitled to. There could be a third reason, a Machiavellian reason why the government doesn't want you to know the size of the reserves, and that is that maybe the money simply isn't there. That may seem fanciful and far-fetched, but the fact that the government keeps putting up taxes unnecessarily, that it says it uses an extremely conservative calculation for the net investment returns contribution, and then recycles most of this into top-ups and endowments and trust funds, which are not only not spent, but are charged again in future budgets to you, the citizens. suggests that the government is hiding something, that perhaps not all is well with the reserves. For this and other issues, please tune in to our live Q&A session and ask us questions, and we'll try to answer them. So thank you very much for listening. Oh yes, and I wanted to highlight what the Reform Party's proposal would be. We have said that in 2021 the government should provide a stimulus payment of $1,500 for every Singaporean adult and $500 per child. This is easily affordable. Despite the government talking about how much it spent to combat the economic effects of the pandemic, during 2020 it only spent about $5 billion on helping Singaporean families and individuals affected by the pandemic. And in 2021, even that rather measly figure has been further reduced. It only proposes to spend $900 million on helping Singaporeans. This is totally inadequate. As I've said, the Reform Party would send stimulus payments to every adult Singaporean citizen of $1,500 plus $500 for each child under the age of 16. We still think that's not enough, but that would be a start, and it would only cost about $4 or $5 billion. Thank you.